Imagine standing naked and trembling before a crowd of villagers whose eyes burn with anticipation as you approach a cauldron of water so scalding that steam rises in ghostly spirals around your face, knowing that your innocence depends not on evidence, testimony, or reasoned argument, but on whether your flesh can survive what no human flesh was ever meant to endure. Imagine the cold weight of iron shackles binding your wrists as you are lowered into a murky river, your lungs burning for air, while dozens of witnesses watch from the banks to see whether the water will accept your body or reject it, determining your fate based on the ancient belief that the elements themselves serve as judges in matters too complex for human minds to comprehend. These were not medieval fantasies or primitive superstitions, but the systematic legal practices that determined guilt and innocence across centuries of European history, transforming the human body into evidence, pain into proof, and survival into verdict, in judicial systems that claimed divine authority while serving distinctly human purposes of social control, political manipulation, and the maintenance of power through spectacular displays of sanctified violence. The ordeals that supposedly proved innocence were in reality elaborate theaters of cruelty, designed not to discover truth but to create submission, not to serve justice, but to demonstrate the absolute authority of those who claimed the right to subject human beings to unimaginable suffering in the name of divine will and social order. In the shadow of cathedral spires and beneath the gaze of stone saints, priests, and magistrates, orchestrated rituals of agony that transformed courtrooms into torture chambers, justice into spectacle, and the search for truth into carefully choreographed performances, where the outcome was predetermined by political necessity rather than divine intervention. The trial by fire represented the most viscerally horrifying of these judicial tortures, requiring the accused to demonstrate their innocence through direct physical contact with flames, molten metal, or burning objects in ceremonies that combined religious ritual with systematic torture under the guise of supernatural judgment. The most common form involved forcing the accused to carry a red-hot iron bar for a specified distance, typically 9 feet, while priests chanted prayers and crowds watched with fascination and terror as flesh seared and smoke rose from burning skin. The iron would be heated in a brazier blessed by religious authorities, its temperature calibrated not for fairness, but for maximum physical trauma, while maintaining the pretense that divine intervention could protect the innocent from burns that would maim or kill any human being, regardless of their moral standing. Alternative fire ordeals included walking barefoot over burning plowshares, plunging hands into boiling oil or molten lead, or grasping heated metal objects that had been consecrated through religious ceremonies, designed to transform instruments of torture into tools of divine justice. The injured hand or foot would then be bound and sealed, with the wound examined after 3 days to determine whether healing had progressed in ways that could be interpreted as miraculous, a standard that was entirely subjective and could be manipulated by authorities who controlled both the initial injury and the subsequent medical examination. The psychological torture was as deliberate as the physical trauma, as victims spent days in contemplation of their approaching ordeal, confined in religious buildings where they were subjected to prayers, sermons, and spiritual counseling designed to convince them that their suffering would reveal divine truth rather than human cruelty. Witnesses to fire ordeals reported that the accused often appeared to accept their fate with resignation, that authorities interpreted as evidence of either guilt-induced despair or faith-inspired confidence, when in reality this apparent calm reflected the psychological shock and dissociation that occurs when human beings are faced with inescapable torture, presented as religious duty and legal necessity. The trial by water took multiple forms that shared the common principle of using the body's interaction with water as evidence of guilt or innocence, creating judicial procedures that were guaranteed to cause suffering while providing authorities with flexible interpretation standards that could support virtually any desired verdict. The ordeal of hot water required the accused to plunge their arm into boiling water to retrieve a stone pebble or other object from the bottom of the vessel, causing immediate and severe burns that would be evaluated after a waiting period to determine whether divine healing had occurred at a rate and in a manner that suggested supernatural intervention rather than natural recovery. The ordeal of cold water operated on the opposite principle, binding the accused and lowering them into a river pond or specially constructed pool to determine whether the water would accept or reject their body based on whether they sank or floated. The theological logic underlying cold water ordeals held that pure water blessed by God would welcome innocent souls while rejecting the corrupt bodies of the guilty, creating a system where sinking indicated innocence and floating suggested guilt, a standard that often condemned the innocent to drowning, while interpreting the survival instincts that kept guilty parties afloat as evidence of their corruption. The binding techniques used in cold water ordeals were designed to prevent swimming, while allowing just enough buoyancy to make the difference between sinking and floating a matter of body composition, lung capacity, and random chance rather than moral character. Though authorities insisted that these physical factors were themselves expressions of divine judgment working through natural laws to reveal supernatural truth. The duration of submersion was supposedly regulated by the time required to recite specific prayers or perform prescribed religious rituals, but the subjective nature of these timing mechanisms allowed officials to adjust the length of the ordeal based on their desired outcome rather than consistent procedural standards. Multiple rounds of lot casting might be conducted if initial results were inconvenient, with authorities claiming that divine will required repeated testing to ensure accurate determination of guilt or innocence, demonstrating the subjective and manipulatable nature of supposedly objective, supernatural judgment. The social and political functions of ordeals extended far beyond individual cases to serve systematic purposes of social control, political manipulation, and the demonstration of institutional authority through carefully orchestrated public spectacles of sanctified violence. Ordeals created powerful deterrent effects by demonstrating the consequences of challenging authority, committing crimes, or engaging in behavior that threatened social order, using individual suffering to communicate broader messages about power, submission, and the dangers of resistance. The public nature of ordeals served educational functions, teaching communities about social boundaries, moral expectations, and the consequences of transgression through spectacular demonstrations that combined entertainment with instruction in ways that made lasting impressions on witnesses. Political authorities used ordeals to eliminate enemies, resolve disputes in their favor, and demonstrate their power to subject individuals to extreme suffering under legal and religious justification, creating tools of oppression that appeared to operate through divine rather than human agency. The random and unpredictable nature of ordeal outcomes could be manipulated through various means: controlling the heating of metal, managing the binding techniques for water trials, selecting champions for combat, or preparing materials for lot casting, allowing authorities to influence results while maintaining the fiction of supernatural determination. The economic motivations behind ordeal systems included the generation of revenue through fees, fines, and confiscated property from those who underwent trials, creating financial incentives for aggressive prosecution regardless of evidence or social necessity. Wealthy defendants could sometimes avoid ordeals through payment of substantial fees or alternative penalties, creating two-tiered justice systems that subjected the poor to physical torture while allowing the wealthy to purchase immunity from bodily testing. The elaborate ceremonies surrounding ordeals required significant resources: fuel for fires, specialized equipment, religious officials, security personnel, that were funded through fees charged to defendants or their families, creating situations where the cost of proving innocence could financially destroy families, regardless of the trial's outcome. Professional witnesses, champions, and specialists in ordeal procedures could earn substantial income from their participation in these proceedings, creating economic incentives for maintaining systems of judicial torture that served financial rather than justice-related purposes. The religious justification and clerical participation in ordeals demonstrate how religious institutions became active participants in systematic torture while claiming to serve divine justice and spiritual purposes through their blessing of instruments, supervision of procedures, and interpretation of outcomes. Priests and other religious authorities developed elaborate theological justifications for ordeal procedures, creating doctrinal frameworks that transformed torture into sacrament and suffering into religious duty, while obscuring the obviously human origins of these practices. The Church's official withdrawal from ordeal procedures in the 13th century, following the Fourth Lateran Council's prohibition of clerical participation, reveals the institutional recognition that these practices were human inventions rather than divine requirements, though unofficial clerical support continued in many regions for centuries afterward. The psychological manipulation inherent in ordeal procedures included deliberate attempts to convince defendants that their survival or suffering was determined by their moral character rather than physical circumstances, creating frameworks of self-blame and spiritual interpretation that prevented recognition of the systematic torture being inflicted under legal and religious authority. Victims who survived ordeals were often told that their endurance demonstrated divine favor, while those who suffered were informed that their pain revealed guilt or spiritual inadequacy, creating psychological frameworks that made resistance or criticism of the system appear to be rebellion against divine rather than human authority. The international variations in ordeal practices reveal how different societies adapted similar principles to local customs and political needs, creating diverse systems of judicial torture that shared common functions while reflecting specific cultural contexts and institutional arrangements. Germanic societies developed elaborate combat-based ordeals. Celtic communities emphasized water-based trials, while Mediterranean regions often favored fire ordeals, demonstrating how torture techniques were adapted to regional traditions while serving universal purposes of social control and political manipulation. The modern legacy of historical ordeals can be seen in contemporary legal and social systems that continue to subject individuals to systematic suffering, public humiliation, and physical or psychological trauma under the guise of justice, truth-seeking, or social necessity. Contemporary practices, including prolonged interrogation, public shaming, social media persecution, and institutional retaliation against whistleblowers or critics, demonstrate the enduring human capacity for transforming cruelty into apparently legitimate procedures that serve institutional rather than justice-related purposes. The historical experience with ordeals provides crucial insight into the mechanisms of institutionalized cruelty and the importance of maintaining skepticism toward legal, religious, or social systems that claim supernatural authority for practices that serve obviously human purposes of power maintenance and social control. Witnesses reported that some victims of cold water ordeals appeared to deliberately exhale air from their lungs in attempts to sink and thereby prove their innocence, demonstrating the desperate calculations that victims made when faced with judicial procedures that guaranteed suffering regardless of outcome, while providing no reliable path to vindication. The trial by combat transformed violence into a legal procedure based on the belief that divine justice would ensure victory for the innocent party in ritualized battles fought under religious supervision with weapons blessed by clerical authorities. Single combat between accuser and accused was regulated by elaborate rules governing weapons armor timing and conditions of victory, creating martial spectacles that served entertainment and political functions, while claiming to provide objective determinations of guilt and innocence through divinely guided physical conflict. When the accused was unable to fight due to age, disability, or social status, they could appoint champions to fight on their behalf, creating a system where guilt and innocence were determined by the fighting skills of hired warriors, rather than the moral character of the actual parties to the dispute. Women clergy and disabled individuals were typically prohibited from personal combat, but could select male champions whose victory or defeat would determine the fate of those they represented, creating legal procedures where survival depended on the availability of skilled fighters, rather than evidence or moral character. The preparation for trial by combat included religious ceremonies, weapon blessing, oath-taking, and formal declarations of intent that transformed simple physical violence into sanctified legal procedures claimed to reveal divine will through human bloodshed. The combat would continue until one party was killed, severely injured, or acknowledged defeat, with the outcome interpreted as God's verdict on the underlying legal dispute, regardless of factors like physical fitness, fighting experience, weapon quality, or random chance that obviously influenced the results more than moral character or factual guilt. Authorities maintained detailed records of trial by combat outcomes to demonstrate the supposed consistency and reliability of divine judgment expressed through physical violence. Though these records reveal patterns of victory and defeat that correlate with wealth, social status, and access to professional fighters rather than moral virtue or factual innocence. The ordeal of the cross required both accuser and accused to stand with arms outstretched in the form of a cross until one party collapsed from exhaustion, with the first to fall considered guilty of the charges, while the one who maintained the position longest was deemed innocent through demonstration of divine favor. This ordeal was supposedly more humane than fire, water, or combat trials, but its psychological and physical demands created intense suffering through prolonged muscle strain, joint stress, and cardiovascular pressure that could cause lasting injury or even death in victims with health conditions that were unknown or undisclosed. The duration of cross ordeals was theoretically unlimited, with some lasting for hours until one party collapsed from dehydration, muscle failure, or circulatory problems, creating endurance contests that tested physical conditioning rather than moral character, while claiming to reveal divine judgment through comparative suffering. Officials would monitor the proceedings to ensure that neither party received assistance, changed position, or modified their stance in ways that might provide unfair advantage, transforming the ordeal into a carefully supervised torture session conducted under religious authority and legal justification. The symbolism of crucifixion was deliberately invoked to suggest that innocent parties would receive divine strength to endure suffering similar to that experienced by Christ, while guilty parties would collapse under the weight of their sins, made manifest through physical weakness and inability to maintain the sacred position. The ordeal of the blessed morsel required the accused to swallow a piece of bread cheese or other food that had been blessed by religious authorities and supposedly consecrated to reveal guilt through choking difficulty, swallowing, or other adverse physical reactions interpreted as divine rejection of corrupt individuals. This ordeal was often used for clergy and other individuals whose social status made fire or water ordeals inappropriate, creating alternative procedures that maintained the principle of bodily testing while adapting to different social and political circumstances. The food items used in blessed morsel ordeals were sometimes deliberately prepared to cause swallowing difficulties through size, texture, or dryness that would create physical reactions unrelated to guilt or innocence, but easily interpreted as supernatural signs by authorities seeking particular outcomes. Psychological pressure and fear could cause genuine swallowing difficulties, muscle tension, and digestive problems that authorities interpreted as divine evidence of guilt, demonstrating how the stress of the ordeal process itself could create physical symptoms that appeared to confirm the supernatural nature of the proceedings. The ordeal of lot casting involved drawing marked stones, pieces of wood, or other objects from containers to determine guilt or innocence through random selection that was interpreted as divine guidance in matters too difficult for human judgment. While lot casting might appear less physically traumatic than other ordeals, the psychological pressure of having one's fate determined by random chance created intense emotional suffering, while providing authorities with convenient mechanisms for reaching predetermined verdicts through careful control of the drawing process. The objects used in lot casting were often prepared and marked by religious authorities, who could manipulate the selection process while maintaining the appearance of random divine choice, creating procedures that served political purposes while claiming supernatural authority. Understanding the systematic nature of historical ordeals reveals how individual suffering can be transformed into public spectacle, how random outcomes can be interpreted as divine judgment, and how institutional authority can be maintained through the demonstration of power over human bodies and lives. As you contemplate these historical practices that transformed individual human suffering into public entertainment and supposedly divine judgment, consider how many contemporary systems continue to subject individuals to systematic cruelty while claiming to serve justice, truth, or social necessity, rather than obvious purposes of institutional control and political manipulation. The medieval and early modern experience with ordeals demonstrates that the human capacity for cruelty is limitless when it can be justified through legal, religious, or social authority. while revealing the importance of recognizing and resisting systems that claim supernatural or institutional authority for practices that serve power rather than truth. If this exploration of history's most systematic forms of judicial torture has revealed patterns of institutional cruelty that extend beyond historical ordeals into contemporary practices of legal, social, and political persecution, share your insights. Subscribe for more investigations into the mechanisms of institutionalized suffering. And remember that understanding historical precedents provides essential knowledge for recognizing and resisting contemporary forms of systematic cruelty disguised as legitimate authority. Would you have recognized the obviously human and political nature of ordeal systems while living under their influence, or would you have accepted the religious and legal justifications that transformed systematic torture into supposedly divine judgment and legitimate legal procedure?